Live and direct, live and a date no jive.
Legalize it.
So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, and welcome back. It's another episode of the Karma Koala podcast. Came across Kimberly Melgoza on LinkedIn, and she's just written a paper called Neo-Shamanism and Mushroom Churches in the US. And a lot of the reporting that I'm doing at the moment with, when I'm looking at psychedelic lawyers, it's a lot of the work that they're doing, but I've not come across any sort of overall discussion of what's been happening over the last 18 months and where we think this is leading us. And especially at the same time as it's running, it was talking about people's rights and the rights of religion. At the same time, we've got rampant capitalism running down a parallel road. And I'm really interested in the intersection of these things and how they're going to play out in terms of US policy, law and regulation. So I was really excited to see that Kimberly had written this paper and wanted to ask her more about it. Sorry, Kimberly, I do rabbit on a bit. Welcome to the show. Thank you for taking time to join me, and thanks for writing the paper. I always ask first, what led you to write the paper? Had you been following it, or was there a particular moment you thought this needs to be covered?
I'm currently a PhD student. I'm in my third year, so I've been doing mushroom research since 2019. And mostly my research was in Mexico and like the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms and like the ritual aspect, and mainly like more historical, like 1500s. But recently I was just asked a lot of questions.
Okay, I'm just going to stop you there straight away.
Yeah.
Tell me more about going back that far. How easy was it or hard was it to research, and what did you learn? Because people say this, everybody's talking about Mexico and Central America, and they're normally talking about going to some ayahuasca retreat at, yawn, but then everybody goes, oh, well, it's been going on forever. And that's the end of the conversation. So firstly, that fascinates me. How did you, as somebody who studied history and literature, how did you research that, and what did you learn?
Yeah, so I actually came across mushrooms in my undergrad because I was studying alcohol in Mexico, so pulque. And then I came across ayahuasca and peyote. And then I found out about mushrooms like being religious. So a lot of my work was archival. So it had to do with the Florentine Codex. I don't know if you know what the Florentine Codex is.
No, I don't. So
yeah.
please let me know. And
yeah.
I'm sure some of my listeners are more educated than me, but I this is why I love to have these conversations, because they're just like a free lesson for me, basically.
Yeah, actually, more likely than not, nobody knows what the Florentine Codex is. So it's basically a 12-volume codex that was written by a Spaniard called Bernardino de Sahagún. And he had the Nahua scribes like write it for him. So it was kind of like it's biased, basically, like from a Spanish view, even though it's Nahua people that were the ones writing it. But it tells you like the people's story. So like the Nahua people. So it tells you like what the gods they believed in, the plants they like used, and
so
like it tells you about the conquest of
their
Mexico.
creation stories, essentially.
Yeah. And also like plant usage. So a little bit of like hallucinogenic mushrooms are in there. So like a lot of my work has to do with like that and like researching that. And like I was looking at like images, and I was looking at murals, and I've done like research from like way past like 9,000 BCE with like murals in like Africa and like just mushroom murals. So it just led me there. And I really like the aspect of like history. But as I was mentioning, like more recently, everybody's like into psychedelics. So everybody's like, what do you know about this? And like this and this and this. And so I just started researching more like modern mushroom like usage in the US. And I came across like multiple mushroom churches, which is why I wrote the article and how I got to where I am.
What were you, did they, to use a phrase, these mushroom churches pop up everywhere, just like a fungus. And then I have difficulty with some of these churches. You know, we know what happens in the US with religious rights, but some of them,
Mhm.
it seems to me, are a way for some individuals to create a business as well as create a church. And I was really interested in, if when you looked into it, how you define the difference between the two and how they define the difference between the two, and what are they doing to say that they're a church, and these are, because they, again, the language is always really woolly. We have a sacred sacrament, and that's it.
Mhm.
But because I live overseas and I'm not in the States, I can't go to these places, and ask people direct questions. And I find if I try and do it as a journalist online, I never get a response. So I find there's a lot of fuzziness in terms of these churches, and how they define themselves. And some of them seem, are very serious and hiring lawyers and going to court and going through that process to identify themselves thus. But what did you find in your research?
Yeah, so I kind of see a little bit of both, where like there are some that kind of feel like they're just a front for like being a dispensary for like mushrooms for people. And then there's others that do believe in like the sacrament of the mushroom. And I guess for me, like my passion in writing this article was that I want people to not forget the indigenous history that comes with like the use of mushrooms. And I feel like a lot of them don't even mention it like on their websites, or like it's not embedded in like their like
Well, it's the
beliefs.
same
And
as the ayahuasca retreat. You know,
yeah.
for me, sometimes there's that they just sort of come, they lock themselves together. The churches in the US and the retreats run by North Americans in Mexico and Central America. It's it's that standard, you know, colonial culture of, picking up something, pretending it belongs to them, and then flogging it back to their own population, leaving the originators of the knowledge, the real knowledge out of the environment, which I'm sure some of them rather that's how it is, but at the same time, it raises a lot of legal issues, both for the indigenous communities and societies, as well as within the legal systems of these countries. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's just like so many complications that happen with like cultural appropriation. And I feel like that is what I want to like uncover with all my research and like write about for like an audience that like to notice like everything that's happening. Because I feel like a lot of things in the US are just like blinded.
When you did the research, what percentage of the people who ran the mushroom churches would speak directly with you?
I've talked to one founder.
Out of how many?
The ones that I was researching, there's like four or five.
Okay.
And it
And
feels more like you'd have to like be there in person to like get to know them, and like you have to like be embedded in the community, because some of them are like in California, some are in Kentucky, some in Utah, some yeah, there's just like scattered around the US.
so let's start with the one who did speak to you. Who was that and where were they?
I'll probably keep that anonymous so that
Okay.
nothing,
Okay. So when
but they were here. Yeah.
you spoke with them, what
Yes.
was their argument for why they created a church, and were they monetizing that process or not?
They were really passionate into the sacramental usage of the mushroom, and they had been for like years, since like 1999. And they wanted like a place for their usage to be legalized, I guess. But upon like going into more research on like their website and like finding out like it just takes a lot of money. Like you have to sign up for membership to like, and you have to pay that obviously because you can't sell mushrooms to people. So that's kind of like the way that a lot of people go through it, like a membership. And second, like you have to take courses, which I agree, like some of them are safety courses with like mushrooms and
Well,
like
that's what I was going to,
psychedelics. It's
how,
important.
because that was my next question is, you studied how that particular church regulated itself. Did they just make it up as they went along, or did they actually work with, for instance, in Oregon and Colorado, they're creating
Hmm.
systems for managing, treatment of
Hmm.
humans with psychedelic substances, whatever they may be, mainly psilocybin. I'm really interested in how these churches decide and self-regulate how they consume and then care for those people in who are supposedly in their care at the time that this experience is happening.
Yeah, I did ask them about it, and they were very clear about like being respectful of like of each person's journey on mushrooms and like careful in that way, if that's what you're asking. It just seemed like, I don't know, I have a lot of maybe bias that I need to like step back and like just let it open. But it just seemed like going upon like any pictures in like their programming, it was just like I mentioned in my paper, it's like a white church for white people, and it's just like you're forgetting the indigenous people and you're forgetting anybody else that like it doesn't feel like an inclusive space for like someone like me to come into the church and just be like,
Although they're talking about expanding the mind and the consciousness, it seems to be marketing to a specific demographic, uh, who can
of course.
then uh, learn something within their understanding of what a psychedelic experience might be. But yeah, as we all know in these discussions, a psychedelic experience can be many things to many people and has much history to it, as you know better than I. And you got a sense that there is just no understanding. Do you think there's no understanding or no desire to really broach that at all?
I don't know. It's tough. I feel like it's more so they feel like it's embedded in there somewhere, but it's not like something that they should be like discussing out loudly, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, like I said, it's like I don't know. It's very expensive. Like when I was looking at, like I mentioned, I was looking at the courses and it's just like so expensive and it should not be a monetized thing. It should be if you're really for like a church and like really for expanding the mind, it should be not a
Well,
business
I
like
mean,
that. But apparently,
I think of
but
a
all
church.
churches are businesses.
Yeah, I think of a
So,
church. I grew up a Church of England, C of E, as we say, and
yeah.
I spent 18 years of my life as a youth having to trundle to church every Sunday at school, and get bored out of my mind. But they didn't take money off me. They passed a donation thing around and you put 10 pence in or something ridiculous. I mean, but these churches seem to be created on, how do we create, just like an evangelical church, how do we create a monetary stream before we actually
Hmm.
think about uh, the big questions like, what is religion, or how do we think about God? You're saying that it works somewhat like one of those Texan mega churches in the way that they think is, how do we get the money first and then we'll tell them stuff afterwards.
And that's like my biggest like pet peeve about that. And it just feels like wrong if you're really for this belief in sacrament. But as I said, like all churches are kind of like a business, especially like in the US. Everything is just monetized here.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I've lived in the US a couple of times, and you obviously you see it in every part of society. So you're telling me that that's the church that would actually speak to you. That's how you felt about them. What about the ones who wouldn't speak to you and that you did research on?
Um,
What did you learn about them?
it wasn't more so that they didn't speak to me. I just like wanted to speak to one at a time before like I got like biased. Like eventually I want to like speak to all of them. There's one like in Colorado where I am, but it's like a little bit ways away. But I feel like that would be interesting because I can actually go in person. And it's just like complicated with like being a PhD student because like the first thing that they think I'm doing is just like doing research on them, which in a way it's true, but also I'm
Yeah,
also
no,
interested in like
obviously
what their
the
practices.
the thinking is different as well because uh, they think amongst. I would imagine somebody who creates an environment like this, although they are thinking about money, so their thinking is fairly clear. But one thing that they tend not to like is lots of questions,
Hmm.
and especially incisive questions that question what they are doing and how they're doing it. Uh, I experienced this the whole time as a journalist or a podcaster. If you start asking people in cannabis or psychedelics, well, not actually less so psychedelics, but I'm normally dealing with lawyers and professionals. Um, but if you start asking too hard questions, especially when it comes to talking about money, they tend to clam up fairly quickly. And the I just everything I read and see, I tend to just want to question what their aims are and why they're doing what they're doing. And it seems to me that they don't really want to do that at all. So I'm not understand. Well, I suppose what I'm trying to say is I'm not understanding why they exist as institutions, other than to get people high.
It's mainly just to get a, I feel like it's mainly to be able to use them legally is like the biggest thing, like religious like freedom through that in the US and having like protection to use them. And although I do believe some churches are believing in this as a sacrament, not every single person that's probably in this church believes in it and it's a sacrament. They're like, oh, free psychedelics or paid psychedelics, I
Well, I'm about to
guess.
say not so free. So basically, the wealthy, it's a back door for them to have a psychedelic experience without worrying whether the law will catch up with them. Uh, Something that's never worried me one part of my life, to be honest. I've never even thought about it. But obviously, that's the sort of thing people worry about, is it?
Exactly. And they're just doing more damage in that way because it's just gonna like backfire for everybody that's been using it for centuries. And it's just like you're using it so much so recreationally that it's just becoming it's gonna just get erased. Like the history is getting erased from like the indigenous people, and it just sucks.
If we go back to Mexico and Central America and the work you've been doing there, and you've been documenting the history, um,
Hmm.
have you come across other people documenting the history, and how is that knowledge being collected and then managed? So I presume when you do yours, is your mainly your research, is that from universities in Mexico, the Central Library of Mexico? Is that where most of the knowledge is stored? And as you say, filtered through colonial activity engaging with the indigenous tribes, because I suppose in the main they had oral culture.
Yeah. A lot of my research, like I said, was like it's more like archival. So it's just like the Florentine Codex, which is now online. So if you're interested in that, you can just look up Florentine Codex by the Getty. And they did a great job of putting it online, and it's so easy to use now. But also, I've done more like research like on mushroom stones in like Guatemala, and I do a lot of like more like history. So like 1500s is like my main like focus, and a lot of that comes from like old texts and like what has been like written about, but obviously through like a colonial lens, like you're mentioning. And even then, it's like it's hard to find a lot of like documents because a lot of it was erased through like colonialism. So anything that we do have is just like very limited. And that's why I got so interested in the topic. And there's a lot of scholars that have been doing research in Mexico and have like uncoded like different things throughout the years. But I guess for me, it was more so like I wanted to like make a timeline. I guess that's like my ultimate goal, like make a timeline of like how the ritual was before colonialism, during colonialism, and then now in contemporary times and like how we got to where we are.
And have you engaged with indigenous healers in Mexico and Central America to discuss their thoughts on how people are appropriating their medicine and also their way of working with the medicine? Um, have you got any insight on that that you can share? And what are their views? I mean, I would imagine they are more aware of the retreat culture in their countries, but what's their awareness of, what's happening under freedom of religion laws in the US, and what do they think
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, I have not had that aspect yet done with my research, mainly because like I said, I was mainly like this historian for like
Yeah.
the longest time until more recently. And I do want to get down there, and I'm from like my family's from Mexico, so it's not hard at all to get down there. But it's just I am curious, and I know that a lot of people like rely on retreats, like indigenous people rely on retreats themselves to like make money as obvious, but a lot of it's being taken by like white shamans that are going down there and like becoming shamans themselves
Well,
and taking over the
let's call them
practice.
fake shamans, because they're not shamans. Yeah, I've had this
Yeah,
discussion before. You can only be a
yeah,
shaman if you've got 6 or 7 generations in your family. I mean, the idea that some
yeah.
bloke with dreadlocks is suddenly a shaman because he took lots of acid, uh, uh, quite frankly, pisses me off. And
Yeah,
yeah, the more I see it, the more I get pissed off by it, basically. So that's why I don't delve. I'm happy to talk to you, but I wouldn't delve into researching it, because I just find myself getting increasingly angry with this
yeah,
constant appropriation and reinvention of something that they weren't aware of in the first place.
exactly. And I'm on the same boat. Like I don't like that they just appropriate names and take over like businesses and just like it's just affecting like the people that use this and have been using it for centuries and have been making money from centuries because that's like a lot of income that comes from that, obviously.
So, do you see, from your research, do you see a growth in these churches? What do you think should happen in terms of managing that growth and regulating those churches? Or is there, the way that they operate under the Constitution, you can't really change that? I mean, that that's what I'm trying to understand, is how 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 are we going to determine what's real and what's not real, as the excitement around psychedelics grows and more people who have less and less knowledge get want to have a bit of the action?
I just feel like we're not going to be able to know what's real or not. Like people are not going to be able to know what's real or not real. They're just going to be excited with like the psychedelic aspect of it. And especially in the US, like you said, like I think it's just growing exponentially. Like the law is getting better with like mushrooms. And in Colorado, it was finally like decriminalized. And so the usage is just like skyrocketing and everybody's using mushrooms now. And it's everywhere.
Is it really? I mean, look, my experience, I think last time I was, not the last time, but the first time I visited Colorado was in the 1983. And I had a very wonderful mushroom experience there at the time. But, it was obviously a very small part of what was happening then. It was very underground. And it's really interesting now to watch how cities across the states are relaxing the rules. And do you get a sense that people will take advantage of that rather than see that as as something to respect?
Oh, 100%. People are just going to take advantage of it. And I know that there's a lot of medical like aspects to mushrooms and like a lot of different like psychedelics. And I do agree with that. Like, for example, it's been used for like depression and anxiety, I'm sure you know. And like MDMA being used for like PTSD and all of this. And I just think that obviously there's not enough research because it's not legal to do research on humans with that right here in the US anyway. But it just my biggest thing is like people should just be educated. Education is like
Yeah, well, educate.
what
Look,
needs to
I
happen.
have this discussion. Before you, I just spoke to a professor at Stockton on the East Coast, and he's been teaching cannabis since 2018. And then earlier in the day, every conversation I have with anybody on the planet with regard to cannabis and psychedelics always ends up, the knowledge has been hidden. It's suddenly boomed, but money has led the
hmm
conversation, and there is no education, because the less education there is, the more money you can make out of people who don't know anything.
Yeah, exactly. And that's like the biggest issue. And I feel like that's just where we're heading towards, like less educated, and erasure is just going to happen. It's just part of what's happening. And with the explosion of like how many people are using psychedelics, and especially in the US, I'm not really sure about the world.
Oh, well, I mean, look,
Anywhere.
I
Yeah.
report on it. I report on it regularly. I've got a column on my website, and it's very interesting. For instance, you wouldn't think it, but I noticed that psychedelics use in India, if you just follow it on the amount of people being busted, is just growing astronomically over the last 2 or 3 years. I'm from the UK. We love we love consuming anything, and throughout Europe, but the rest of the world isn't formalizing it in the way that the US is, and doesn't have, as you say, these legal loopholes like the freedom of, the ability to create a church, to so people can practice religion, whatever that may be.
Yeah.
Where do you think this research is leading to? I mean, you said earlier you wanted to create a timeline looking back. So do you think your research will say, I'm not interested in the present and what the future is creating? It's better to try and create some historical certainty. So over time, at least there's as you say, a timeline. Is that really what you're looking to do? And are there more people like you doing that as well? Because look, there is not very much of this information out there. You've got your Michael Pollans and all these sorts of guys, but they're really, I mean, they're traveling salesmen as well in a way. They just use longer words.
Yeah. I do want to do history, maybe not for my dissertation. I think for my dissertation, I really want to focus on mushroom churches in the US, and maybe do like a case study and go in like attend these meetings in person and like stay in it for a while and just see what I find through that research. I think that's my goal. And then in the future, I want to do more historical analysis and get back into like and going to Mexico and all of that. Just because right now it's like probably a little difficult with like traveling to Mexico and doing research there and all of this other things based on everything that's happening in the world. And I feel like that's like a step in my career later on.
Okay, well, look, we're almost out of time. As I said, I knew I'd run out. I knew I'd run out of time. Look, thanks for talking to us about your research.
Yeah.
Love to hear more when you publish something next. So do get in touch. Thank you very much for being on the Karma Koala podcast. And keep at it. Because I do think it's really important to document these churches, whether they be churches or not, so people can define which ones are and which ones aren't and what they're doing. Because I think my fear is, there was a lot of crazy stuff because of psychedelics happened, as you went into the early 70s after that. And I fear that, some of these people are heading down that same path, and it's not going to end up as a good story for certain rather innocent people. And I think it's really important to document who's doing what, where, why they're doing it, or why they think they're doing it, but more importantly, exactly who they are. So if something goes wrong, they can't do a disappearing act, because normally that's what happens with this sort of stuff. Is when things go wrong, they suddenly you can't find them, and then you find 10 years later they've reinvented themselves somewhere else on the planet, doing something similar. So I think it's really important research to follow these churches as they grow in this time of loosening legislation and lots of money flowing around.
Yeah, I will definitely keep you posted. And if you're interested, my name is Kimberly Melgoza, and I have a website, kimberlymelgoza.com, I believe.
Okay,
So,
fantastic.
Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize the earth. Coming out, match, gonna koala bear. Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, great, Barry, a reefer.